it's a cool day. We're learning lots of stuff, and I'm really glad that we could see those fossils. And I'm going to give you, I'm keeping track. I have some prizes for people for the best thing or the most unique thing or the most beautiful thing. So I have a few prizes, so don't let me forget. So it might come up in this talk. There might be something in this talk that's kind of pertinent to the to those prizes. So something that you hear might be worth something. And Laurence is here. Laurence Tisdall is our speaker, and we're really glad that he's here. And I was wondering about what his favorite thing was, and I think it's dinosaur bones, big bones. He's been out west, and he's gotten, he's seen the big ones. So this is something that Rosemary thought of, too, when we were younger, and maybe someday in your life you're going to get to go to Alberta or BC, somewhere out there. That's where the big bones are. So keep that in mind. Someday you might make a family trip, or you might have some time you get out there. And anyway, so I'm really thankful for Laurence. He's going to give us a talk about the flood now. And it's just an eye-opening idea. Okay, thank you.
I want a shirt like that. Did you get it in Joggins itself? Yeah. Yeah, okay. Good. What's the password? All right. Fantastic. So I hope everybody's eaten. So I'll try to get through this before you all fall asleep. From the biological processes that are at work to fight all the sugar you just took in. So, so I have like 45 minutes before you start going, all right, get a hypoglycemia. Okay, so because we went and saw some fossils, John and I thought it'd be a good idea to talk about Noah's global flood, about the flood that's clearly in the scripture. So we're going to take a look at different topics of that are of interest associated with the flood. So we have, and at the end we'll talk about these fossils I have here, and you can come down and see them. So what we're going to go through is the Bible and the global flood. We're going to talk about catastrophism, fossils, and strata. We're going to talk about two models in very, very high level. One's called the hydroplate flood, and the other is called the catastrophic plate tectonics, or CPT. So what are two scientific models that we work with to understand the flood? And there's a third one, but it's not considered very much. And flood predictions and validation. So any model in science will have predictions. We make predictions from the model, and if those predictions true, well, then we have more confidence in the model. And so we'll look at some of those flood predictions and models. Are we ready? Anybody here? All right. Well, there's one here. She gets a prize. Well, I don't know what it is, but we'll give her a prize. Might be a DVD. All right. So speaking of Joggins, that's Joggins. The cliff you see there, the bend. Now, you've seen bends like that here as we get to Gatineau Park. When you just come into Gatineau Park, you can see on the left the cut through, and you can see the bends. This goes on, this cliff that you can see is on an angle, is for like 2.5 kilometers. So you got to think about that. That means that it was 2.5 kilometers deep. It's being tilted up, laid down 2.5 kilometers. That's a lot of sediment. You got to think about that. The thickness of the ice shelf in Antarctica is about 2.5 kilometers. That's a lot of sediment. So where did this sediment come from? So we're going to look at, I believe it came from the flood. And there we find out, I didn't bring my Joggins fossils here because we weren't speaking specifically about Joggins. I could have. I have a whole section because I took 24 people to Joggins. And about half were teenagers. Sort of interesting experience taking teenagers anywhere. I guess Pastor John would know about that. You try to lay down the rules, right? When you have like 16 teenagers to say what you can and, a little framework to what you can or cannot do as they're in their own rooms and everything and in the motel. And no one thought to say, don't go take a walk at 2 in the morning and not tell anybody where you're going. So you get this knock on the door at 2:30. Oh, so-and-so and their friend haven't come back and it's been a half hour. You're like, You go out and there's like 2 directions. And you go, oh no. So how we split up is that all? It's at 3:30 in the morning trying to find where these. They ended up, they decided they wanted something from the local dépanneur down the road. And oh man. So anyway, we had a great time though. We brought back 500 kilos of fossils, which now it's protected. You're not supposed to bring back fossils, but the fossils are falling out of the cliff all the time. And we had a great time. We actually baptized two youth there in the Fundy Bay, right? Fundy Bay has a 45-foot tide. It's always cold, very cold. Just the time it took, because we believe in full immersion, so they got all the way into the water. I can tell you I didn't feel my legs. By the time I baptized 2 people, I was out and I could hardly feel my legs. It was so cold. But anyway, it was great. We had a good time. And in fact, my vice president of my Creation Science Association, she ended up getting married because of the Joggins fossils that her husband brought back. They weren't married at the time. They weren't even going out. He brought it back. He met her on a metro. He said, they started talking about his trip and fossils, and he married. Now they have 7 kids. They live in Hawkesbury, and she's like the second in charge of homeschooling in Quebec and stuff. So anyway, Julie Charette. All started with Joggins. So fossils are a good thing. So let's talk about the flood. 3 things we could look at concerning the flood. 1, evolution would say the flood is either local or it's a myth. Okay, because people talk about the flood. They say it's either a myth, something made up. It's a fairy child story or something that's been created, like say King Arthur, this kind of thing. Or it's a local flood. There were lots of local floods, and it just became something of importance to the Mediterranean area, and so it became into mythology. There's theistic evolutionists. These are people that believe in evolution, but they believe in what happened. Okay, I don't even see a mic, but that's fine. All right, what mic? Oh, that mic. All right, good mic drop. Yeah, I'm sure the sound people really don't like when we do that. So theistic evolution are people that believe in God. Many Christians are theistic evolutionists. They believe God created, but that evolutionary processes were from then on. They always believe in a local flood. They're always very much on the defensive on a global flood. So there you have like the day-age theory. So that's St. Augustine. He had this idea there was like a day-age, and each age represented, each day in creation represented an age. And you could throw in, so not Christian, Jehovah's Witnesses believe in like 1,000-year days. So I asked them, how did the plants go without sun? Because sun was on the 4th day and plants were on the 3rd day. They don't have an answer. So St. Augustine was 3rd day. Then there's the gap theory. The gap theory is the idea that there was a sort of pre-creation, often looking at Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and saying that there was a gap between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, and that there was like a pre-creation, and usually they want the chaos there is created by Satan's angels, and they have this whole idea around that there was like and honestly they'll think, and this is in the Schofield Bible, they'll think that dinosaur bones would come from that pre-creation. So they think a lot of the fossils would be pre-Adamic. Now there are specific issues with that I'm not even sure I go into in this talk. Some major issues, being the number one issue is theological. You've got death before Adam. Okay, so if you've got death before Adam, there's an issue, because death came by Adam. Or we've just taken out 2/3 of the New Testament scripture. And you've also got an issue with the concept of Jesus confirming with his own words that man was there at the beginning of creation. So in Mark 10:6, Jesus says, the beginning of creation, God created man and woman. So there isn't like a long time of evolution. They're there at the beginning of creation. There's no way of reinterpreting the words beginning of creation. They'll try to say, oh, Genesis 1 is maybe poetry. Wait a second, we're not Genesis 1, we're Mark 10:6. Jesus is speaking. He's talking about divorce, he's talking about marriage, and he says, in the beginning of creation. So if man and woman are there at the beginning, it's the beginning. You don't have like a gap of time. And there's no evidence for that time anyway. Third position on theistic evolution is progressive creationism. So that's Hugh Ross, Henri Blocher on the French side. He's Henri Blocher I deal more with because I'm more in the French ministry. He's at the head of the University of Paris, a theological faculty, and writes many great good stuff, but in this case I don't agree with him. And so that's the idea that he's very much an evolutionist, local flood at most, and he just believes that the humanistic science that we have, the millions of years, etc., is true, and that there never was a global flood. And then there's the creationist model, or the creationary model, which is the global flood. And so let's take a look at that. Now, one of the questions we could ask is, if there's no scientific reason for long ages, what would happen to the theistic evolution? In other words, if I could show you that there's no evidence of time, then the justification for theistic evolution just drops off, which is why it becomes quite a contentious issue, the age of the earth, because when you show that the earth is young, a whole bunch of arguments just disappear. Evolution doesn't have time to happen, never had time to happen, but even in imaginary world, it doesn't have time to happen. And theistic evolution doesn't work anymore, so then you're stuck with Genesis, whether you like it or not. So let's look at what it says. And God said to Noah, this is Genesis 6:13, and God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Okay, so it's destructive. We do talk, well, we'll see in a moment. And behold, I myself am bringing flood waters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh, of which is the breath of life, in Genesis 6:17. So what are we talking about? We're not talking about insects. They don't breathe like we do. They just osmose through their carapace. So the flood doesn't have, obviously the ark doesn't have fish on it, right? So it's clearly defined breathing creatures. Everything that is on the earth shall die. So this is clear that from Moses' perspective, the words used here are indicating something that's global, not regional. Okay, whether we like it or not. And when we look at the descriptions, and you got to remember, all flesh means human, animals, because the covenant in Genesis 9:8-11 that we get after the flood is with humans and animals. So it's like everybody is involved, because when they get off the flood, it involves humans and animals. It's not just humans, because they try to get around that. It's humans and animals. So what happens? What's the mechanism that's mentioned in the Bible? Now, we only have 2 chapters on a momentous event that I'd love to have an encyclopedia of information about. We don't have it. We just have what we have. And Genesis 7:11. So the fountains of the deep were broken up. So something breaks up far down below the earth. And when it breaks up, then the windows of heaven are opened. And it's interesting, the rain starts after the fountains of the deep are open, and the rain stops after the fountains of the deep are closed. So the source of rain is the fountains of the deep. And when we talk about rain, it's not nice, clear rain like we have. It's mud. And in fact, I should have brought that. In fact, I have a fossil that I found when I was in Joggins of fossilized raindrops, where the rain's coming down and it made imprints. Think how fast that fossil happened. It's very instantaneous imprints. But it's mud. It's raining mud because of all the erosion along the side. I'll get into that in a moment. So what else he says? The waters prevailed and greatly increased on the earth. Okay, we get that point. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered. Okay, which also makes it, they even talks about the waters. They don't just prevail. The word is like they triumphed over the mountains. The mountains couldn't stop the waters. So obviously this puts a bit of a question about a local flood. If you're going over the mountains, nothing's local anymore. Genesis 7:21, and all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, cattle, beasts, every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man. So this is not a good thing. This idea we have, I have a sermon about this, but this idea we have, Noah and his wife, and they're happily waving, and you have a giraffe and a rabbit on the boat that hardly doesn't even have enough place for the giraffe. Well, the reality is that this boat is 3 foot, it's like a football field times 3 in size. It's got thousands and thousands of creatures on it. And the last thing Noah and his wife are doing are waving. Because for 120 years, Noah is the world's worst evangelist. He preaches for 120 years, and not one person except his family, which probably didn't have much of a choice, comes on the boat with him. So you can imagine that when God closes the door and it starts to rain, and all these contractors and people that work with him and stuff that help build the boat and that laughed at him, they're all of a sudden going, let us in now, we believe you, it's raining. But God closed the door, Noah didn't close the door. So Noah's not sitting there going, yeah, because over the next 7 days, they basically watch all their friends drown. Judgment of God. Nothing's funny about this. This is a judgment of God. It's very serious. Now, the Jews understand that. We, in our context, make it like for children, which doesn't help us because it makes it look like a myth. When in reality, it's very, very important to our theology, and it's important to what we see around us, as I'll explain in a moment. And it's important to understand the seriousness of what we're talking about here. All in whose nostrils was the breath of life, the spirit of life, and all that was on dry land died. And he destroyed them. Now we're in Genesis 7:23. He destroyed all living things which were on the face of the ground, both man and cattle, creeping thing, etc., bird of the air. They were destroyed on the earth. Only Noah and those that were with him in the ark remained alive. The waters were prevailed on the earth 150 days. It actually took probably a couple of weeks before the ark even floated. And then the flood lasts a year and 11 days. So there's a long time when the flood's going down. A lot of tectonic stuff is happening, a lot of movement of earth, a lot of underwater volcanoes, a lot of stuff we can go into. But the point is here, we're talking about a momentous event that would seem in the Bible to be global, okay, and be affecting all. It talks about all men, right? We agree? In case that's what's written there. Whether we like it or not, that's what's written there. So let's look. Do we have evidence of this idea? Well, let's go. We don't have to just be in the Bible. So you have the Sumerian pictures you see here. So this is the Noah, the ark. So almost all tribes around the world talk about a flood. And here you see their version of it. You have this one, which is in the Totec of Hawaii. They have a box that floats where man survives. Often they'll have the same number of people. Hinduism, interesting enough, talks about Vishnu. And this word nu actually comes from nautiloid, comes from the Noah's name, Noah. The Noah in Hebrew would be Noah. And Vishnu, fish Noah. Let's read what they're saying here. In the beginning, now their beginning starts at the flood. In the beginning, the cosmic egg was surrounded by the infinite water of the great chaos. Inside there was Vishnu with 3 other gods and 4 goddesses. Isn't that interesting? So the Hindu religion believes that there's Vishnu and there's 3 gods. Vishnu, Noah has his 3 sons, and they all have their wives. 8 people in the ark. They're talking about the same story. The earth was covered with water, right? And Vishnu, Boar, we think is the name of his wife, reestablished it as it had been before. The 8 gods were born, right? A first time from the mother's womb and a second time from the cosmic egg. The 7 gods were thankful to Vishnu. It's from the Rig Veda. So you get this in almost all mythologies around the world. We get this story of a flood. We get a story of these gods and goddesses and things that as they try to interpret things. And I'll explain to you perhaps why they're talking about gods and goddesses in a second, or demigods in the Greek mythologies. It all comes from the flood. You can understand almost all mythologies, including the Amerindian mythologies, from the flood. I remember I was up in just Wanaki, I think it is, just beside Quebec City. There's an Indian village there. And I noticed along the edge of the river, there was a drawing of their origins. And they often have a turtle, which is interesting because Hindus talk about a turtle too. And they have a turtle, and then they had these 8 creatures. Why do they have 8 creatures with the flood? Why do they have 8 creatures? Because each one is a characteristic. That creature has a characteristic of someone who's on the ark in their idea. But it's the same story. So the Chinese language, which of course made up of pictograms, so pictogram is made up of a series of characters. What's interesting about Chinese is that, contrary to a written language, if your language is based on pictures, you can't change it, right? The picture is a picture. You can't change it because the picture means a story. If you draw a house, it means a house or a home. So the picture always means a home, and you have to keep trying to figure out what that picture means, or you just remember it by rote if you've lost the story. But it has a story. It's not a series of syllables put together. It has meaning. And those characters haven't changed in 4,000 years. So there's some interesting things in these characters. So if you add these 3 words together, you'll see the first one means vessel, the second one means 8, and the third one is a mouth. Put that together and you get this symbol, and this is the symbol for boat. So you have 8 mouths on the vessel, and that is right now in Chinese, that's the drawing for boat. That's the character. When you want to say, I went somewhere by boat, you have to draw that. So you ask them, well, why are you always putting 8 people on your boats? Why are there always 8? I don't know. It's always the way we've done it. Oh, maybe I can tell you. Maybe I have an idea that relates to the Bible. There's other examples like this one here. The word for flood that you see there is a combination of characters of which you've got total, which means together the earth, 8 people on the earth plus water is equal to the word flood. That's inscribed in their language. Now, an old $20 bill, Canadian bill, that is the Hayada flood story. And that's the Hayada Noah with the animals and everything around him. That's their flood story. So you got these flood stories all over the world. Everybody talks about a flood. Not everybody talks about Noah. Not everybody talks about a dove. Some do. You have these characteristics that show up. The Bible talks about the full story. But you always have this. So why, if something is only local, does everybody talk about it around the world? Well, probably because it wasn't just around the world. And in fact, if we look at the population dynamics of the earth, the population of the earth and how it grows, and we were talking about the age of the earth a few minutes ago, if you take the population now and use the calculation that's used to calculate what the overpopulation is supposed to be in the future, let's use that same calculation, go back, you get to around 0 about 4,700 years ago when there was a flood. Yeah, if you start with humans 1 million years ago, there's an overpopulation problem. But not on Earth, in the whole universe, because you'd have more humans than atoms. Okay, and that takes into account wars, famines, all kinds of issues that can happen. Takes all that into account. We still have this Malthus diagram. And, okay, it doesn't go to 0, it goes to 8. But you understand what I'm saying here? The issue is humans can't have a history of 2 million years. It's not possible. The calculations are there. Now, when we talked about the fact that mythologies have this gods and goddesses and stuff, look at this slide. You'll see that before the flood, you have Adam, and those are his lifespan. So before the flood, you'll notice in the Bible, it talks about these people that live 900 years old and more, right? So you've got all these people except for Enoch, who was 300 years, but you got Methuselah, Lamech, and then Noah, who lives 950 years. Now, then you have the flood happen. Shem lives 600 years. Arphaxad, so then you got 3 generations, about 420. Peleg, Reu, Serug, Nahor, Terah. Now look, there's Abraham. We know Abraham. So Abraham can speak to, in theory, he could speak to Noah. And certainly could speak to Shem. Now, Shem and Noah and the other sons have started forming governance around and cities around the world as they populate, especially after the Tower of Babel. And they start populating the world, and they create governments. And their god, the fish god, is always the wise god, always related to Noah. And you'll notice it becomes, in the Bible, the fish god is Dagon that the Philistines had. And that was actually Noah from the Philistine side was Dagon. But it gets all messed up, of course. But what's interesting here is that when you live, let's say you're in the, you're Peleg, or let's say you're even Terah, the father of Abraham, you live and die, you've lived over 200 and some odd years, 225 something years, and up above, they're still going to live another 100 years. So these people are never dying. You've gone through 10 generations, 8 generations, and they're still living. So they become the demigods. Because they're not dying. So this Noah and his sons and daughters, they become the gods and goddesses of mythology because they don't die. And you can actually relate the names up to them through the different mythologies through Europe and everything. There's a great book by Bill Cooper called After the Flood, which I think is free on the internet, you can get it, which is an excellent survey of the European royal families and where they go to, even Norwegian, etc. They're not Christian in any way or Jewish, but they all have this, they relate up to the same names of Noah and their sons, the same. And of course, with Greek, it's really easy, and Roman, etc. It's very easy to find the man of the flood, Seneo and Oannes. So John, actually, the word John comes from the name for Noah. He said it doesn't sound like Noah. Yes, but what happens is in the Greek mythology, you have Oannes, which is Noah, and you have Seneo, who's the god who's the man of the flood or the fish god. But Seneo and Oannes are just reversals. It's the same word in reverse. It's the same person. And then you start saying, oh, Oannes, John, Oan. That's where you get John from. So there you go. A little bit of extra. So you can see here that date, right? You got right down to Isaac. You can talk to someone on the flood. So this isn't a long verbal tradition about the flood. They can speak to someone who's on the boat. Sort of cool. Moses is just a few hundred years after that. Okay, so Are there sightings? Yeah, there's quite a few sightings. If you go to that website, Noah's sightings over the years, we think the boat's broken. The Genesis talks about the mountains of Ararat, not just Ararat. Ararat is clearly a submarine volcano that is a very interesting volcano. I have a friend of mine who's gone to the top of it, Guy Leduc, and as a geologist, and he wasn't looking for the ark, he was looking at the geology. But the ark's there, and I presume as the ice is melting more and more because we're in a warming cycle with the sun, I presume that we're going to probably start finding it at some point, and I presume that would create sort of like a Jewish revival if they started getting more evidence of the flood. And my idea is that maybe God's just like waiting for the right time, because it was known before, and there's like lots of sightings. So the waters returned from off the earth continually, Genesis 8, and after the end of 150 days, the waters were abated, and the ark rested in the 7th month on the 17th day of the month on the mountains of Ararat. And the waters decreased continually until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the 1st day of the month, the tops of the mountain seen. He doesn't get off right away. There's a period of time, releases crow, releases dove, and the dove, even when the dove comes back, the branch, he doesn't get out till 3 months later. As things were going down. There's a lot of things happening when water's going down, though. It's not a soft thing. It's catastrophic. There's a lot of things happening as water's going down. So I don't have time to get into everything, but these are like some of the sightings. So there's a long list. Just go to that site, nwcreation.net/Noah sightings, and you'll get some more information. So clearly the Bible talks about a global flood. We have some evidence from cultures around the world about a global flood. Let's talk about evidence for catastrophism. Are we talking about something that's very uniform that created these rocks, slowly sediment deposited? Or are we talking about something really, really big, fast that deposited? So let's look. Do we have examples of catastrophism that aren't quite a global flood? Yes, actually in Canada. So this here is about the North Lake Agassiz. So this lake doesn't exist anymore, but it's in the west. It's enormous. It's 1,600 cubic kilometers of water. And the dam broke, something broke, and the water was released. And it created a canyon 250 to 300 meters deep, a third of a kilometer deep, with water that was moving at 80 kilometers an hour. And it just, there was a waterfalls, like Niagara Falls, 300 miles wide. It's like going, imagine a Niagara Falls that would go from Toronto to Kingston or Brockville. No, Kingston. Solid water. It just dug out Washington State, part of Washington State, and it created these canyons, dry falls. They call it the dry falls because now there's nothing goes over it. But when it released it, so it shows you the power of water. They can even see here fossilized waves. See in that bottom picture? Ripples from the currents. And in fact, if you go on Google Earth, you can actually find ripples that go across the province, I believe, of Manitoba in areas that are from the flood. They're massive ripples that are much, much bigger than this. Cover, I think they're like 10 miles, and they go over 10 miles. You can only see it from the air, but Ian Juby showed me that. So we know that catastrophism can produce, in a very short time frame, canyons. Okay? So we know we can get these formations quickly under catastrophic conditions. We know there's lots of water. There's drainage of lakes under Antarctic glaciers. So we have massive lakes under Antarctic glaciers that move, and it creates these kind of rock formations that we see here when they just emptied themselves out. And they talk about this happening millions of years ago, but it's drainage. So again, it would be catastrophic. Let's talk about the Grand Canyon. Now the Grand Canyon, one of the world's most awesome erosional features, it's 446 kilometers long, including 60 miles of marble cammon. And what's interesting is the famous Colorado River is supposed to have dug this, would have had to go upstream to do that. The way they explain it is that it was dug and then it lifted up, but there's no evidence that, there's more evidence that it lifted up before the water went there. The depth of the main segment of the Grand Canyon varies between 3,000 to 6,000 feet, 900 to 1.8 meters, 1.8 thousand meters deep, okay? With a rim to rim about 6 to 29 kilometers. This is massive, just massive scouring. Of course, you could ask where the sediment went, and that's a great question because they don't have an answer. The tilted pre-flood sediment layers, so you can see here, So here you've got the top of it, which are the flood deposits, and then you've got the pre-flood deposits, which are underneath, and then you've got the basement rocks, the earth. And so those ones are tilted, the pre-flood are tilted, are up to 14,000 feet or 4 kilometers thick. I mean, we're talking like unthinkable depths of sediment. And in fact, the upper layers that you see there, the horizontal flood layers, cover the entire plateau, and in some cases, the vast majority of North America. So they're continental because it was a global flood. You'd expect continental formations. These are some of the continental formations. The Colorado River, they thought it was like, it's a sort of, they call it the capture theory. And because they're trying to figure out, they're trying to get the canyon to be created by the Colorado River. But the canyon's much, much too big for the Colorado River to have ever dug. This takes catastrophe. And what it is that there was a lake above, in a plateau, there's actually a beach at the top where there was an enormous, enormous lake at the top of the Grand Canyon that emptied itself, whoop, and dug the Grand Canyon. And in fact, I believe it's the Hopi Indians. There's a tribe of Indians that disappeared. They have it in their tradition. Well, they don't, but the ones who knew them, the whole tribe disappeared in this catastrophe. And that's the catastrophe that actually built the canyon. So the question is, where's the debris? Where did it all go? Because if it went out the Colorado River, it reaches what's called the Gulf of California. So there'd be you got to think, if you empty the Grand Canyon, there's a lot of debris that's not there. So you would think that, because you need a 4,000 cubic kilometers. Think of that, 4,000 kilometers by 4,000 kilometers by 4,000 kilometers. That's the amount of soil that was eroded in the Grand Canyon. It's not in the Gulf of California, okay? So it went somewhere, but I think it was in a much bigger event than the Colorado River, because the Colorado River doesn't have 4,000 cubic kilometers of debris at the beginning of it, right? And actually the same problem is found in most rivers. You don't see the right amount of debris. And so you can see, now another problem in the Grand Canyon is there's no talus. Talus is what you see at the bottom. I can't point on the screen, but you know, you see at the bottom of the cliff, there's like an accumulation of debris. Well, if this thing's supposed to be millions and millions and millions of years old, where's all the debris from erosion? It's not there. Why? Because it was washed out in the event. There's a lack of debris. Millions of years would expect a large amount of talus at the base of cliffs. It's a known issue. The most obvious areas for this lack of talus is within the side canyons, ending in a broad U-shaped amphitheaters. Some of these amphitheaters are hundreds of feet deep, extend back as much as a mile from the river, and the majority have no water source to remove the material. So if you can't remove the material, the debris should have built up, but it's not there. So this is what they think happened. Grand Lake that you see there and Hopi Lake emptied itself into the Grand Canyon. And they don't exist anymore, but they had, just Grand Lake, to give you an idea, is twice the size of Michigan. And Hopi Lake is about the size of Lake Huron. So imagine 3 Great Lakes emptying themselves. That pushes out 4,000 kilometers of soil, of rock. Just digs through rock. So that's part of what happened. In fact, in the Grand Canyon, you have, now you all are specialists on nautiloids and cephalopods, there's Nautiloid Canyon. Nautiloid Canyon is really cool because they have all these nautiloids, but also because they have, I'll show you in a second, they're billions, we're talking billions, straight-shelled chambered nautiloids that you see here are found fossilized with other marine creatures in a 7-foot or 2-meter thick layer within the red wall limestone. So it's the layer, it's called red wall, it's red, of the Grand Canyon. This fossil graveyard stretches 290 kilometers across northern Arizona and into Nevada, covering an area of at least 10,500 square miles or 30,000 square kilometers. It's numbers that are hard to conceive. It's so big. These squid-like fossils are all different in sizes, from small, young nautiloids to their bigger, older relatives, to form such a vast graveyard that's within 100 cubic kilometers of lime and sand and silt. So it would need, water here moved at about 5 meters per second. So it's going very fast, about 18 kilometers an hour. and catastrophically just overwhelmed the cephalopods. And so you get this type of thing where the nautiloids line up, because remember, they're long and straight. So if you have a flow, they're going to automatically align themselves with the flow. And this is clearly the situation. And it's not there. The lady is actually beside some nautiloid fossils from Morocco. And there you see that, again, those nautiloids are all lined up because it's a flow. It's not something slow here. It's something very, very, very fast. Now, in the Grand Canyon, they talk about it, you look at all these rock layers. Oh, that must be the full rock layer. That must be all the different layers, because we have like all these different layers in our books and things like that. So you have like the Cambrian, and starting at the Cambrian. Before Cambrian, there are no fossils. So these are identified actually by what fossils are in them. So they say, well, this is Cretaceous because it contains dinosaurs. This is Jurassic because it contains ammonites. Devonian might contain this type of fish. Cambrian would be because it has trilobites in it. Okay? So they don't identify it by any dating method exactly. They identify it by the fossils that are found in it. That's where it gets its name. And then they say, how old are the fossils? Well, we think they're this age. Did you date a fossil? No, you can't date a fossil because it's sedimentary rock. You can't date sedimentary rock. Why can't you date sedimentary rock? It's because it's a mix of rock. So if you're trying to date it, you wouldn't know what you're dating. It's all mixed up. Sediment. It's not like granites or igneous rock, because then you'd have, well, you wouldn't necessarily know when it happened, but it all happened at the same time, whereas sedimentary rock is mixed. So no one dates normally fossils with radiometric processes. So they just have decided that the fossils are that old, and therefore the rock is that old, but there's no evidence for it. Because that decision of the age of the fossils was done back in Darwin's day, before radiometric dating existed. It's a convention. It doesn't have anything to do with truth. So let's look at this here, the Silurian, which is sort of what, there's some cephalopods here. So we have certain layers in the, you have a whole ecosystem. In the Grand Canyon, okay, so this is just Permian, just shows you different fossils, environments, ecosystems. In the Grand Canyon, you don't have all these layers. You have the Cambrian, you have the Devonian, you have the Jurassic, and you have the Cretaceous. That's all. But it's not like you're walking on the Cambrian with the trilobites and there's like a space and the Devonian's floating above you, right? The rock is all on top of the other. So what you actually see is more like this. They say this isn't a problem, but in fact, it's an extremely, it's in French, extremely serious problem here, because there's 150 million years that are missing. How do you get rid of 150? Here we're missing 450 million years above. So they say, oh, it just eroded. But here, you've got the Cambrian, you've got the layers above. What happened to all the layers in between? They're gone. The layers of rock are on top of each other directly. You can't even put a paper between them, because there never was 150 million years. There's no trace of the 150 million years. It's not there. You just got rid of a quarter of all life, evolutionary lifetime. So that's what we see in the Grand Canyon. You're missing 150 out of 600 million years. That's a major problem, friends. It's not a small problem, it's a major problem. But it does respect a global flood, which says it's all happened at the same time. And that what you're looking at is different fossils that are put down under different conditions that we can get into a bit later on. So if you believe in a local flood, well, you do have a problem with water that's like 6 cubits over the top of the height of a mountain, because the water doesn't like stop there like you're seeing in this picture. And if it was a local flood, God could have told Noah, just go to the other side of the mountain where there's no flood. You don't even have to build a boat. He just saved 120 years. It's a pain and suffering. Just go to the other side, and there's no flood that's going to go there. Local flood. So let's talk about the water. Where did it come from? Where did it go? Because they say, oh, where did all the water come from? The global flood. Wait, does someone forget? The earth is 70% covered with water now. Only 30% above water now. So let's take a look. It doesn't take a lot to go into a flood environment. So if the crust, Jacques Cousteau put this, if the crust of the earth was leveled with the great mountain ranges like the Himalayas and the ocean abysses like the Mariana Trench, which is off California, evened out, no land at all would show above the surface of the sea. The earth would be covered by a uniform layer of water 3 kilometers deep. I'm not saying the earth is flat, but you understand what I'm saying? It doesn't take much to bring these deep trenches up, mountains down, because even evolutionists believe the mountains came up, trenches went down, bring them up a bit, you've got water over the whole earth in no time flat. Having a flood over the earth is not a problem. Having enough water isn't a problem. And what would you expect? What would be a prediction? If we had water on top of the mountains, we would expect to find fossils, marine fossils, on the top of mountains. Does that make sense? Right? If you had the water over the mountains. Okay, well, let's go to the top one. Let's go to the highest one. It's Everest, right? Interesting enough, you have limestone at the top of Everest. Limestone was put down in sedimentary rock and water. And what do we find as fossils? Ammonites at the top of Everest. So I'm not saying that the water was over Everest in its present height, but when Everest was formed, water was over Everest. And they're during the flood, and these fossils were created. Now, all the fossils here, we'll talk a second about fossils later on, but you'll see like fish fossils and things, they're very easy to see. They show no deterioration. They show extremely quick fossilization. It's all catastrophe. Now, another issue is the rate of erosion of mountains. So let's take a look at the Himalayas. Because the mountains erode, they move up, but they also erode. What do we see here? The erosion rate of Himalayas is estimated to be 2.7 millimeters a year. You say, oh, that's not very much. It would be over millions of years, right? A million millimeters is starting to get some distance, like a kilometer. So the lifting of the Himalayas is estimated to have started 50 million years ago. Let's do the calculation. The eroded sediments should have a thickness of 135 kilometers, but they don't. Nowhere on Earth do we have a crust that's 135 kilometers. Okay, it doesn't exist. So we're talking about the calculations don't work with these millions of years. They just don't work. 50 million years. All the calculations associated with time and accumulation don't work. No matter what you do, it doesn't work. There's no problem if you have a young Earth, no problem if you have a flood, but you have a big problem if you're trying to calculate little things that move, like the population, human population, like this, the moon that moves away from the Earth several centimeters a year. Okay, so how long can you get it closer to the Earth before it's going to cause a problem with the Laurent's limit where it breaks up? You can keep going forever like this, right? Almost anything, you start trying to accumulate a bit at a time, it doesn't make sense anymore. The calculations don't work in this example. Okay, we good for that? We've gone some fossils, we've done some strata, we've talked about catastrophism, we talked about Bible and global flood. Now we're going to jump into a little bit about the hydroplate flood and the hydroplate, some models, scientific models. Really quick, just a few slides. Again, if you want to find more about it, you have to dig in more. We're doing this in 1 hour, where it's a very high level, but it's enough to get people interested in some simple questions, dig deeper. Okay, so Walter Brown's flood, Walter Brown's hydroplate model, hydroplate being hydro water, plate means the plates of the Earth moved on water. So what he's saying is he looks at those mountains, the tallest mountains in the world are at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. And so there's like 36,000 feet, much higher than Everest, is in the middle of the Atlantic. And so if you take those crusts there, if you take where those mountains are, and you say, okay, let's put it together, but instead of trying to put the continents together, like they do in plate tectonics, put the plates together so that they meet where the mountains are. And that means you have a continental coast. So off the coast of our continent, there's what they call the continental coast. So you can be like 300 kilometers or more, and then it drops. So if you take that as part of your continent, let's keep in mind, just think of the Mediterranean, big Mediterranean. But the Mediterranean is just water on top of soil, right? It's on top of rock. So it's not like the Mediterranean is a gulf to the center of the Earth. There's a continent under it. So same with the ocean, there's a continent, there are plates under it. And if you put these plates together properly, then things work better. This doesn't work. Okay, you end up with breaking apart things or parts of continents that disappear. So Walter Brown says, well, let's do something different. Let's bring them together associated with those mountains we see in the Atlantic Ocean. So his idea is there was one continent, lots of water, floating forests, etc. And the sources of the deep that broke up started in the Atlantic. So there's a crack maybe a kilometer deep, starts in the Atlantic, and starts splitting the crust of the Earth. And so what happens is this takes about 2 hours to go all the way around the Earth. It would be sort of like if you took a pumpkin and tried to split the pumpkin with a knife going in both directions. what would happen is when you got around the other side, you would never, the two knives would never meet up. Why? Because the pressure in front of the knives is higher than the pressure behind it, right? Because you've opened it up. And so it's going to make these Y, these, well, we sort of call it Ys. It goes like this. And that's exactly what we see in the Pacific Ocean. We see all these Y, where it would make sense that if something like this happened. And when it happens, so let's take a look at this. So his idea is that you have this underground water, the Bible talks about that. You have the basalts, and then you have the granites, and then you have seas, and you have small mountains, etc. It breaks up, and then you get this. So this would be where the Atlantic Ocean became. Instead of having, because it doesn't work when you try to move the continents apart for 200 million years, there's not enough salt in the ocean for the salt to the ocean to be 200 million years old. So it can't have taken 200 million years. So he's saying this all happened here. Everything's in its place. You get this crack. You get these fountains of the deep open. Rain starts coming down, but it's eroding the sides. And as it erodes out, you have no more pressure over where there's no more rock because it's eroded out. And that creates something that's quite interesting. I'll show you in a second. So you get these massive out water, comes down as rain eventually, but some of it just flows out. Very warm, hot. And you get the continent plates look like this. So you have extreme rain, you have water covering the earth. And then what happens is because there's no pressure in the middle, the mid-Atlantic range starts to rise. This can happen in a quarry. People who own large quarries, this will actually happen. If you take off all these layers of rock, the quarry will actually go up like this. And you'll have your machines can be on its side on large quarries. So you get this pressure from the center of the earth. So this is what he's saying happened. And then we can get the continents to start moving. Because there's no question the continents moved. The question is when and how. So he says his model says the continents move fast because there was water under them and water over them. Therefore, he reduces friction. Because trying to move the continents at the fast rate they need to move to do some of the formations I'll show you is not possible with rock on rock. It would become like a heated, molten furnace, the whole earth. So he's saying it happened during the flood, underwater. And so you have something like this that looks, and then you have the gravity does this, and then you get these formations that look like this. So this in the Rocky Mountains. So you need something to explain these, because this is like you folding the Rocky Mountains, right? So you have pressures from each side. So the rock is put down, the sediment is put down flat in layers, and then it's folded because of external pressure, because the plate itself is moving, but it has to be moving fast. They'll say, oh, it just took over millions and millions, it went really slowly. That's not true. If it went slowly, if you're trying to bend rock, it would melt everything in it. And what research has shown that we have the same type of rock inside out, that we're not seeing that evidence of melting. And we find fossils in the Jurassic has this all the time, in the Alps. We find fossils in the Jurassic, they're not melted, they're not disappeared, etc. In fact, this is a Jurassic. I was in Switzerland many, many years ago, 2004, and doing some conferences, and they took me up the river, and I saw this mountain, and I said, I want some pictures. So these are my pictures. There's a cow there with a bell. I always found that funny, why they put bells on their cows. Found out that it was because they use public pastures, and each family has a bell with its own sound on it, so they can get their cows based on the sound it makes. Pretty cool. Anyway, I was more, of course, interested in what's behind that cow. So in the Rocky Mountains, unlike here, when you see something, sort of like those who come from the west, who was it you, the gentleman back there who comes from Alberta, you see the mountains, you say, okay, I'm going to get in my pickup truck and I'm going to go, an hour and a half, I'll get to the mountains. An hour and a half, you're only partway there. The mountains are bigger, but you're not there yet. I remember doing this from Calgary. we said, oh, we'll just go out in the evening and go to the mountains, and after about 2.5 hours, like, we're not there yet. So anyway, because they're so big. Well, these are big mountains. It took us a long time to get behind that cow. I got close enough to get this picture. So fantastic here. See, look at the folding. Folding is phenomenal here. The folding, you can see it's like 180 degrees, like a sandwich. Clearly shown this will happen quickly by incredible forces. And if you look above, look at the limestone above, you can see these straight layers. So after this fold happened, there was other events that were happening on top of these mountains that were putting other layers on. They say, I've seen estimates of 80% of the Alps aren't there. Sort of like the Grand Canyon. Where did all the sediment go? The Alps have the same problem. They have these mountains that go up. There's nothing. But if you did this with it, you'd say, okay, that's a lot of stuff. Where is it? No one knows where it is. But whatever it is, you can't move it off slowly. It's catastrophe on a scale that's unimaginable. Okay? So that's a hydroplate theory. If you go to creationscience.com, he has his whole book there. You can take a look at it for free. Good stuff. Another model is John Baumgartner's CPT model, catastrophic plate tectonics. So he follows more the accepted view of plate tectonics, not in ages, but in terms of the formations and stuff. But he says, I think that the continents moved because they were sucked in because continents moved under other continents catastrophically during the flood. Okay? So his model is interesting. They slide and sink into the mantle because of density. They're cooler and more dense in the rock underneath, so they slide. And the rapid movement is due to the weakening of the rock in the mantle because of stress. So we're not going to go into a lot of it, but just to say, this is like how you have all these different levers that are very hot in the center of the earth. And the idea is that the continent would, you can see that green that goes down, you can see continents go under into the mantle. So the question is, can you get the continent to slide under the mantle fast enough to actually move these continental plates? Well, there's some experimentation he did here. So he did a calculation. In fact, John Baumgartner, who's retired now, but I knew him also before he was retired, he had the largest private budget of any research laboratory in the US as a Christian. He was, his money came from military, of course, and it was on earthquakes. And he did the modeling of this with thousands, tens of thousands of points. So this is really important work. And he basically shows how this could happen, how cold material would quickly go down to the bottom under a specific instance. And I think I have something that shows it, like just running. Here we go. So this graph is like years and years of work of taking data and putting it in and measuring things from all over the world. And you can see how that cold matter drops to the bottom suddenly when it's like the stress suddenly releases itself, and there's hot matter that comes to the top. And the hot matter, because it's all a question of when things that are cold and things that are hot have different densities, so they float at different levels. So, is there any evidence for this? Interesting. They find, if you look at this as the Earth, under the Earth there's this blue temperature. Now keep in mind when I talk about cold, it's not cold, because we're talking about 3,000 degrees Celsius, but the blue part there is cold matter near the core of the Earth, and no one knows how it got there, because it doesn't fit any model. But it would fit John Baumgartner's model. So it could well be a combination. Now the hot stuff that's coming up, that you see coming up, would come up higher than the cold because it's less dense. So it would come up and float higher, about a mile higher, sort of like the Grand Canyon. So that's a little bit of some of the evidence models, and there's lots of work done with that, and I'm just showing you this in a couple of slides. But just to say that scientifically, creationists are working on different models to explain the Earth. It's probably a combination of the two. We definitely see evidence for a hydroplate model. We see Coriolis effects that go through all of Europe. You know, Coriolis is like, I guess the easiest way, if you look at a drain, or like a bathtub, you water down the drain, the water turns in a specific direction. But if you're in rock, it can actually, like, it can freeze the direction. And we actually see through the continent of Europe Coriolis effects being published in the Canadian Journal of Geology. All right, let's go to the last section, flood predictions. So, global flood happens, then it should cover the whole continent. So we have the Tapete sandstone found in North America, Israel, and Egypt. So that's global, right? And so you've got some more Tapete sandstone. You've got the red wall limestone that we talked about. Red wall some fossils of the cephalopods. North America, England, and the Himalayas. So in Tibet, worldwide. You can see here in England. We've got more limestone, like the cliffs of Dover. Find that same limestone in North America and Europe and India and Australia. So these are continental formations, global formations, which is exactly what you'd expect from a worldwide flood. Now, we have in the Grand Canyon something really cool called the Great Unconformity. And there are two formations that are on top of each other, and the problem is this. The Dox formation, or the darker sediment you see there, is supposed to be 1 billion years old. And the Tapete sandstone, which is on top, is 500 million years old. So we're missing 500 million years. We're missing 500 million years is not there. No evidence it ever was there or ever existed. So the model's wrong. The dating model is wrong if we look at the Grand Canyon. It doesn't work. And on top of that, there's some very logical things, like Sir Henry Howard. He says the absence of erosional markings by water, as in valleys and gorges in the deep strata of the Earth, is fatal. In other words, if we're looking at 400, let's say here in Quebec, we got 150 million years. Well, where's all the valleys? Where's all the gorges? Where's all the canyon? Where's all the erosion over 150 million years? There's nothing. You see the strata. You're walking along the strata. You got all these things coming up. Where's the valleys? It's not there. That doesn't make any sense. How can you pull 150 million years? We get valleys in tens of years. Instantly in the Saguenay, when they had the water came out, whoop, they had instant valleys. How do you do this? He says, and this was written in 1905. He says, any theory that proposes that each formation rose out of the water to become a habitable surface, he said, I'm only going to ask to find the excavated valleys and mountains of the ancient strata in Earth similar to those we see in present. You look at those strata when you come into the Gatineau Park, you see all those tilted strata? There's no valleys. There's no erosion, right? There's nothing, it's just strata. Straight, one on top of the other. Grand Canyon, all these strata. Supposed to be millions and hundreds of millions a year. Where? Joggins. Got 2 kilometers of strata, but there's no valleys, there's no erosion. That model does not work. Mount St. Helens blew up and formed a canyon like this that was over 60 feet. You see the woman at the bottom? That canyon was formed in 23 hours. Now, in this case, it wasn't water, it was air, turbulent air from the volcano coming down. But all those stratified rock layers were done in 23 hours. And what else would we expect? Well, we'd expect in a catastrophe, we'd find gravestones of fossils. That's what we find. A paleontologist in South Africa estimates there are 800,000 skeletal remains of vertebrate animals in just one formation, like this. Here, what else would we expect to find? We'd expect to find fossils, the tops of mountains, like Everest we talked about. How about this? Here's a clam in Peru, 2 miles up, so about 3 kilometers up. There's an oyster, not a clam, oyster. That's 3.5 kilometers wide. Wait. 3.5 meters wide. Wait a second. I didn't know oysters could climb mountains. Did you? You know that? Got to the top of the Andes. Very perseverant. How about this? Fish giving birth to fish. Actually, it's a plesiosaur giving birth to something like a plesiosaur. Mosasaur giving birth to another birth. I mean, that's instantaneous fossilization. This is from Quebec, from the Missisquoi, I think, area. Here you've got a fish eating a fish. Pretty fast fossilization, wouldn't you say? Here you've got a moth. I've got an insect or 2 down. I've got an insect down there and a leaf fossil. The insect's from Germany. Instantaneous fossilization. Dragonfly, instantaneous fossilization. We look at fossils, they're mostly instantaneous because it was catastrophic. It wasn't a slow sedimentary process. Joggins, well known for this. This is my picture. This is what was in the cliff. I mean, this isn't like when we were looking for these little fossils in the rock. This is over 10 feet, 12 feet tall. So it's like you can't really miss it if you're walking by the cliff. There are others. There's a whole forest there. And you can see even the root of it going below. So obviously this tree didn't sit there being fossilized over tens of thousands of years in water without any degradation, right? This was done all at the same time. And there are forests. In fact, Greenland has 45 forests like this, same type of material. 45 forests. They say, and it's like semi-tropical. We're talking Greenland. Alligators. Ellesmere Island in Canada, they find alligators, oak trees, all kinds. Were there alligators up in Ellesmere Island? No. What really happened is if you have a flood and the water is covered the whole earth, you have floating forests. You know, vegetation material is floating around in the flood. Floats around massive amounts. And it gets, if the water is covering the earth, you don't have anything to stop. You don't have any coasts. So the energy when the earth is turning is at the equator, is the highest. So things near the equator are going to move towards the poles because there's less and less movement, right? Because you're going a farther distance here and a less distance here. So there's much more energy being expended here. So stuff is going to move. And that's why you have 45 forests, one on top of the other in Greenland, which we also have in Canada, on top of the other because they moved from near the equator. Didn't mean Canada was at the equator. Remember what we read. There's other stuff I could say, but we don't have time. Finally, let's talk about global planation surfaces. Around the world, we have mountains that are cut off at the top. They're just flattened. There's nothing left. There comes something called tabletop mountains. They're just whoop, completely flattened. The mountain went above there. It's gone. Well, sorry, but that takes a global flood. That isn't some local flood here. I mean, look at this. In Wyoming, just cut off. These are all over the world. When I was down in South Africa, there was a tabletop mountain. And it would just, you could see a big mountain going like, whoop, just completely flat. We call it tabletop mountain. And this one's amazing in Venezuela. Look at that. I mean, we're talking kilometers down. These cliffs are 400 meters. This is to produce that, you have to have water on top of the mountain, ripping out everything. Global flood. Scientists who believe in a global worldwide flood, you can see here the list goes on and on and on, doctorates and other that believe in a global flood. Many people have been convinced of creation because of the global flood. Evidence for global flood, and they become Christian actually because of it. So let's finish with this. Because interesting enough, Peter, I don't know if you can see that on the screen. It doesn't show up too clear on mine, but in 2 Peter 3:3-6, there is a verse where Peter is, the apostle, is prophesying of what would happen in the last days. And he says this. He says, knowing this first, that scoffers, people who laugh, will come in the last days, walking according to their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? Who believes that Jesus is coming back? Where is that promise? He says, because, and they're justifying this by saying, since the fathers were asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. In other words, they're saying everything is uniform. There never was a catastrophe, no global flood. And he even confirms this. He says, for this they willingly forget that by the word of God the heavens were of old. So in other words, God created the universe by his word, right? That's his mechanism. And the earth standing out of water and in water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. What's he talking about? Peter's talking about the global flood, isn't he? He's saying in the last days, they're going to willingly forget the global flood. We're in the last days. But the evidence is there. You've seen some of it. We've just taken a few minutes. We've gone through. It's so easy. It's everywhere. Now, we don't know all the mechanisms, all the details. We're working on that. That's fantastic. But it's clear there was a global flood. And that shows. But and we didn't. If you want to read those verses, and then you read the following verses, and Peter says the reason no one wants to face the global flood is they don't want to face the fire to come. They don't want to face the fact that there is a God who's in charge, and we're going to be accountable to that God. That's why they don't want to look at the flood. Because this shows God is sovereign. We're not. God is. And so Peter is saying, well, we need to give our life to God. We need to submit to his authority. And that's why Jesus came. We could be in communion with God and be in relationship with the Creator because we're separate from him. But it's interesting that Peter really says one of the emphasis things that they're going to refuse in the last days, the flood. And it makes me so sad when I see in Bible colleges, including Trinity, including ones that we know in the Pentecostal realm, that they refuse the global flood. They don't understand. They're going right along with Peter's prophecy of what the scoffers are, but we shouldn't be part of those scoffers. And the evidence is clear. We have a global flood. And that it's exactly like the Bible says in Genesis. So we have Genesis is true from the beginning. The Bible is true from the very first verse right to the very end verse. And many, many scientists, myself, believe that and see the evidence of it in creation. So thank you for being with me today. Hope you enjoyed that.
You have any questions? Lynn.
Yep. She gets the mic.
My question is about the dinosaurs.
Yeah.
So we didn't touch on it, and I know that could be a very long topic, but just for the sake of the kids here, I'm sure that we can open up on why the dinosaurs died, and did they ended up on the ark.
So what do you think? Why did the dinosaurs die?
Well, my theory would be that they did end up on the ark, but then their species died over time because they couldn't sustain themselves at the size they were.
Okay. Does everybody agree with that? Anybody have any other ideas? I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just wondering. What do you think? You agree? I agree. Okay. I would say I'd agree with part of the answer. Remember, the fossils, for the most part, are made during the flood. And post-flood, during the flood. So if we find dinosaur bones that are fossilized, they weren't on the ark. Okay, so they were buried. But all dinosaurs, are about 75 species of dinosaurs. All dinosaurs, the 75 species were on the ark. They wouldn't have taken the very big ones, taken small ones. And yes, indirectly, they didn't die, I don't believe, of their size. I think they died off for several reasons. One is, of course, environment. The environment drastically changed after the flood, very drastically. Think of Noah. He lives 950 years. His son lives 600 years. His sons live around 600 years. That's a disaster. Imagine you live 90 years old, but all your children are 95, but none of your children get by 60. That's a disaster. None of your fifth generation on get even past 30 years old. They're all dead. It's a disaster. We think 300 years is old. Noah's like, you haven't even hit midlife crisis. It's 300 years is nothing. So the environment changed drastically, affected plants. It didn't just affect humans, it affects everything. A lot of it probably due to radioactivity from the tectonic movement of the Earth. So things degraded quickly after the flood. Dinosaurs also were affected by that. And they were they were probably eliminated by humans. We know they were, right? You have all these stories of dragons being eliminated, reptiles being eliminated, sea monsters being eliminated by hunters in Europe, etc. So you have these stories all over where they're getting rid of these monsters. But of course, dinosaurs did survive, and there are some alive today. Mokele Mbembe and things like that. You can look it up in Wikipedia. They're in the Congo, sauropod dinosaur. There's not many, but they're always usually around equatorial type areas, where it's hot and typical to a dinosaur environment. So I think it's a mix of things. I think it's a mix of environment and humans to get rid of. Maybe a little T-Rex is fun, but it gets bigger, not so fun. So they probably didn't get quite the size anymore. That there's something different, before and after the flood. So, but we have a whole talk on dinosaurs, and maybe someday Pastor John will invite me back and we can talk about. I actually have my testimony is Jesus loves dinosaurs, and so we can talk about that sometime. All right. From the, if you want, I'll just spend 2 minutes talking about what's at the table, and you come up and look. When you come up and look for the young ones, don't touch because of the grease on their hands. I can't get it off the rocks. That would not be a good thing. So, what we have here, talking about dinosaurs, these are dinosaur eggs, real dinosaur eggs, from a